All right, so here we are on video 2 of this quick training series. And in video 1, I kind of outlined for you some of the challenges that you might be experiencing as a teacher, while at the same time having a sense that you're on this path, right? You're on this continuum, you're on this journey as a teacher, and you have this vision in your mind of where you want to be as a teacher, how you want to come across, how you want to feel in your body when you teach, and the knowledge base that you draw from as you're teaching. And so one of the things that I wanted to focus on in this training is giving you a tool that you can use specifically around one of the biggest parts of teaching, which is the skill around cueing, and a tool that you can use to understand cues that you hear by kind of analyzing them of sorts, so that you can understand the anatomy behind them. And this is also a great way to start to bring to light some of the learning gaps, some of the knowledge gaps that you may have when it comes to anatomy. And that's really important. It's not to make you feel badly or to kind of point fingers or place blame with anybody or any training or anything like that. It's really more to kind of make you more of an educated consumer, so that going forward you can make really good decisions about the programs and trainings you invest in, knowing that you know what you need to learn and that training is a good match for that, rather than what I was saying in the first video. And when I had talked to my Facebook group about this, people were saying, oh, I definitely don't want to keep doing that. And that is just this cycle of signing up for this training and this workshop and that workshop, and still not getting the results that you want. So I've got this here. Again, I know it's probably hard for you to see. Know that with this free video series, there's a download. And this download is all of this content. And I call it the Cues Evaluation Template. So I just really kind of have this here just to remind myself of the points on the template. You can print it out and be going over it as I go through this video here, or you can just sit and relax and listen, knowing that you can print that PDF out after we're done. So I want you to think about words that you say when you cue over here, and then taking those words and kind of putting them into a machine of sorts. And I'll kind of call this kind of the analysis machine, right? And so here we are, we're out here teaching and we're giving a cue. And then if we stick the cue through this machine, and there's a process that it undergoes, let's say there's some analysis and there's kind of applying anatomy to that cue. If we're looking at it from the perspective of, hey, what's the anatomy behind that? What's the rationale behind that? And then out the other end of this analysis machine comes the rationale for the cue. Now, one thing I want to point out to you, this by no means means that I've analyzed the cue and I've come up with a decision as to the cue being right or wrong. And this can be an area that trips up teachers sometimes, because I think even the way some things are presented in social media, in articles, by yoga publications no less, there's this sense that some things are right and some things are wrong. And while I think there might be a particular group of things that you potentially could apply those very black and white criteria to, for the most part, things are kind of fluid. We're dealing with bodies. People's bodies are very different. We're dealing with the application of anatomy to people who have varying degrees of just kind of awareness of their body, physical conditioning. So many times it's not that we're trying to analyze a cue to say, oh, well, this is right. It's more that we're striving, this is my suggestion of course, we're striving to be teachers who are sharing cues that are grounded in knowledge, and they're cues that we can present a rationale for, rather than my least favorite phrase, which is, I'm just using that cue because that's what I was taught. I mean, there's nothing that gives up your role in the process more to someone else than to basically just say, that's what I was taught. Even as a student, even when you were a student as a younger person in school, you had a role in your learning. And your role oftentimes was to question, well, why is that that way? And why is that that way? And somewhere along the way, for many yoga teachers, their questioning ability went away, and instead they just took in, I'll just say that, without really asking the questions and or finding out the why behind it. So that's what this process describes. So let's take a look at some of the factors that we're going to apply, right? As we kind of take the cue and we stick it through this process, what are some of the things that we need to consider? Well, one of the things we need to consider if we hear a cue is, and we want to understand it better in terms of the anatomy behind it, is what are the anatomical actions involved in that cue? So if I'm saying to somebody, you know, come into bridge pose and lift your hips and contract your gluteus maximus, but don't do it too much because that could create some injury in your lower back. What are the anatomical actions involved in what I am cueing in that particular pose that's applying to, right? So that's one factor. Another factor is what are the muscles involved? So for that example I just gave you, gluteus maximus would be the muscle. So what is the gluteus maximus? Where is the gluteus maximus? What's its origin and insertion? What are some of its primary actions? Is it acting concentrically? Is it acting eccentrically? Those are some of the questions that you would ask. Another thing is, what are the joints involved? In the example I shared, the joints primarily are the hips. Are they at any particular risk? What about the SI joint in that scenario there? So what are the joints involved? Again, this is all kind of going through this analysis. Another thing is the cue too specific or is it too general? And keeping in mind we're in this framework or this paradigm of teaching group classes versus working with someone one-on-one, because that's going to be the majority of your experience as a teacher unless you're in a particular niche area where you're primarily working with people individually. So another thing to consider is, does the cue have broad applicability or is it really specific? And while it might even be a good, reasonable cue to give, is it so specific that it lacks that broad applicability that we need for teaching group classes? Another thing is the pose static or dynamic? Is it something where I'm giving a cue and the person is stagnant or, static, not moving, holding for 5 to 6 breaths? Or is it a cue that I'm giving in the process of that kind of flowing from pose to pose? That's another variable we want to consider. Certainly cues that I'm giving in more static postures are going to have different implications for the joints and the muscles versus cues that I'm giving when people are moving around a lot. And then the last thing is, what is the frequency? Is this a cue that's associated with a pose that I'm doing a lot? And if so, that probably has a lot more weight than a cue that I'm giving in a pose that I might teach every once in a while and that students might experience every once in a while. That might be weighted differently. So these are all factors. Again, they're all listed on that PDF and they all have to be considered. Now, before I go on to the next video, I want you to just sit for a moment and think about, could you, for the cues that you generally provide, could you map out all of these factors? Because I promise you, these are all very important factors for understanding the rationale behind the cue. It's essentially saying, here's the cue, can I reverse engineer it back to all of the logic behind it? And if you're feeling like, wow, I don't know that I can actually do that for all the cues I give, that's a sign, right? And again, this is not for good or for bad. It's so that you can be more empowered as a teacher when it comes to how you're going to proceed forward in your training and your choices about trainings that you take, and in just uncovering kind of what's really happening behind the cues that you say. So stay tuned for the next video and we'll go a little further.